My friends, hello. Today we have with us a friend of the channel, Master Akim Fadili. Thank you for being with us, Master.
Hello, Aldo Sterni, thank you.
And today he's here to explain something that's hard for us to understand. It's the story, Nicolas Sarkozy. I made a video yesterday about Nicolas Sarkozy, about his famous conviction that made headlines in the media. They say he might go to prison, maybe not, maybe he'll end up with an ankle monitor. We know he wore the monitor for quite a while, so we're trying to understand. And with us, I think there's nothing better than having a lawyer of the caliber of Maître Akim Fadili who will answer our questions about Nicolas Sarkozy. So here you go. I'll throw the question to you. We haven't really talked about it, okay? We didn't talk about it before. You and I know the topic, but we didn't prepare. You don't know the questions because I didn't share or discuss them with you earlier. So this is the first time I'm going to find out what you think about it, what you have to tell us. So the big question is, what's going on? Why exactly was Sarkozy convicted?
Thank you, Aldo. So I would like to go back to a key trigger in this case. 1989, September 1989. And you remember, Aldo, it was the attack on the Douglas commercial, 772 Douglas commercial, Union of Air Transport, 772 Union of Air Transport, meaning Union of Air Transport, which was a French airline that took off from Brazzaville, the capital of the Republic of the Congo, to land in Paris. And there was a bomb on that plane. The plane exploded in midair over Niger in a desert, killing exactly 160 people, including 54 French citizens. Act 1. You might ask, what does this have to do with Nicolas Sarkozy? The connection turned out to be direct, because there was a trial, of course, and there were a lot of plaintiffs. And the person who was convicted as the number one culprit was a certain Abdallah Senussi, brother-in-law of Mohammed Gaddafi and vice president of the intelligence service. So he was at the head of the Libyan state, behind Mohammed Gaddafi, the dictator, at the head of a regime which people have denounced. Act 1. So,
Master Fadili, do we know the reason, the motive? Why would he have blown up that plane? Did he have any interest in doing it?
well, first of all, I'm not going to go into details. There were many lawsuits in France, the United States, and even at the European Court of Human Rights. There was a serious problem with compensation. There was a settlement with the Muammar Gaddafi Foundation. The motive wasn't very clear, but let's say the underlying motive. It was a form of blackmail related to the fact that Libya was isolated from the international community, and that blackmail was supposed to make the West give in. Regarding that stance, it was supposed to, but if you want, we can do a segment another time, because that issue will return, of course. We'll talk about it again, you'll see. On the occasion of the appeal made by Nicolas Sarkozy, the Paris Court of Appeal is expected to rule in 6 months. Because there are detainees. Normally, when there's an appeal like this, it takes more than a year, the time needed to thoroughly review the case file. But since there are already detainees, well, in order not to further hinder individual freedom, well, the appeal trial is in 6 months. 6 months, that's very fast. So I'm coming back to that point. September 1989, attack on the Douglas commercial, 10 Union of Air Transport, 772. 2005, you have Bryce Hortefeux, who has a secret meeting with this Abdallah Senussi.
All right.
And that's where there's something very serious in this case. It's that we still have a prominent collaborator of the Minister of the Interior at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, who is at the head of a sovereign power, the Interior Ministry, and who oversees both French domestic and foreign intelligence, and who therefore goes to Libya to discuss a corruption pact. What is this corruption pact? It's a promise to finance Nicolas Sarkozy's campaign, who was a candidate for the 2007 presidential elections, for an amount of $50 million. Promise of funding. and there is a document to that effect. Act 2. Time passes. Act 3. Mediapart, the famous online newspaper Mediapart, which everyone knows, publishes this document from Libyan archives. Because
Is this document authentic, sir? Is it authentic?
yes, I'm getting to it. I'm getting to it because there's something very important. Because the day before yesterday, Nicolas Sarkozy, when he made his statement after his conviction at the Paris Judicial Court, said that the president had said that this document was a fake. He insisted on that.
That's it.
And so I'm going to shed some light for the listeners on this element of forgery. So Mediapart publishes this document. This is the beginning of the case in 2012, 13 years later. In 2025, this case is being tried. So it wasn't judged lightly. There was more than 10 years of investigation. There was still the National Financial Prosecutor's Office on the case. There were dozens of investigators. I mean dozens. There were dozens of magistrates who looked into the matter. There were adversarial debates. And there were more than 3 months of trial with some of the greatest criminal lawyers our country has. So when this decision was handed down the day before yesterday, it was not a betrayal, contrary to what people want to say. It was a judgment that is very well reasoned, and it's more than 400 pages long. That's really huge. So let me go back. Act 1, the Douglas Commercial 10 Union of Air Transport, 772 bombing, 2005, Bryce Hortefeux. Collaborator, member of Nicolas Sarkozy's staff, Minister of the Interior, who meets Abdallah Senussi, who is labeled a state terrorist by the international community. There is no doubt about that designation. So he meets him for a corruption pact, a funding deal, a promise to finance Nicolas Sarkozy's election campaign up to $50 million. And in exchange, once elected president of the Republic, Nicolas Sarkozy would reintegrate Muammar Gaddafi into the Concert of Nations and would, quote-unquote, clear Abdallah Senussi as well. Act 2?
That's not what happened in any case. I don't know if Sarkozy got his hands on the 50 million. Either way, I know he didn't keep his end of the deal.
Absolutely. So what exactly happened? Because you told me, is this document a fake? Is it authentic? You should know that when this document was published,
Nicolas Sarkozy and Bryce Hortefeux filed a complaint against Mediapart for forgery.
and this trial lasted 4 years. In the first instance, Mediapart was acquitted of forgery and use of forgery. Nicolas Sarkozy and Bryce Hortefeux appealed. The Paris Court of Appeal upheld the judgment, acquitting Mediapart of forgery and use of forgery. Nicolas Sarkozy?
Master, does that mean, sorry to interrupt, does that mean at this point that according to the court, the document is therefore authentic? That's what it means, right? We don't have them. For example, could he have lost the case on technical grounds, which have nothing to do with the validity of the document itself?
I'll get to that since there's been a lot of commotion since the day before yesterday, and it won't stop because there's going to be a problem involving Nicolas Sarkozy. I'll get to that later. But in any case, there was an appeal to the Court of Cassation, and the Court of Cassation, which is the supreme body of the French judicial system, equivalent to a Supreme Court, rejected the appeal. So, in a final and uncontested and indisputable way, the French justice system did not consider this document to be a forgery. That is very important. And it is on this element that, of course, the investigation by the National Financial Prosecutor's Office took place, which includes some of the best magistrates in our country. You should know one thing, it's that in this document. That's where we took this visit of Bryce Hortefeux to Libya to meet Abdallah Senussi. It was from this document that we learned that there was a promise of funding in the amount of $50 million. You should know these $50 million were transferred from Libya to an offshore company. That's what the investigation revealed. This offshore company was managed and administered by a certain Ziad Taqiyuddin.
Taqiyuddin, who died 2 or 3 days ago.
Exactly, absolutely. and this Ziad Taqiyuddin, then he withdrew a lot of money. Millions of dollars in cash, which he brought back to France in 2007, right in the middle of the election campaign. So that's the situation. We have a promise of presidential campaign funding from a Libyan state that is shunned by the nations. And this promise is signed by a state terrorist who was recognized as being responsible for the deaths of 170 people, including 54 French citizens. We then have proof that funds were transferred from Libya to an offshore company in the amount of $50 million. How did we learn this? The investigation revealed that an advisor to Gaddafi, wrote everything down in his notebooks, and we found that amount in his notebooks.
Then
The investigation revealed, with evidence, that this offshore company was managed and administered by Ziad Taqiyuddin,
Who became Nicolas Sarkozy's main accuser? I'll revisit that later, even after his death.
We're still going to hear about him. Even after his death, he will act. You'll see why. And so we also have proof that this Ziad Taqiyuddin withdrew cash from this offshore account to bring it back to France in 2007. That's the situation the investigation was faced with. I'll discuss the conviction and decision from 2 days ago. What did the judge say? In a very well-argued way, he said, I do not recognize the illegal financing of an election campaign. I do not recognize it.
So, Counselor, did he dismiss the 50 million? Does that mean it's no longer part of the case? Is that what the judge did?
He says, I do not recognize illegal financing. I do not recognize passive corruption. I do not recognize concealment. On the other hand, what do I recognize? Well, organized crime. Why? I don't recognize it because I start from the principle that this document from Mediapart, it doesn't give me all the information that would allow me to establish this qualification. This document, considering the full investigation, in light of all the evidence, undoubtedly allows me to say, and to affirm, and to proclaim, to declare, that there was a criminal conspiracy of which Nicolas Sarkozy was the leader, with two subordinates, Brice Hortefeux and Claude Guéant. So that's the subtlety of the judgment, and that's the precision of the judgment, and that's the conclusion of the judgment. So, when Nicolas Sarkozy, with, let's say, quite an excessive boldness, says they found nothing, the document is a forgery and only based on an idea. When he said it was just an idea, about campaign financing, I was convicted. It's not just an idea. These are positive actions by Brice Hortefeux, then by Claude Guéant. They actually received money. They received money, and Claude Guéant received 500,000 euros. That was proven and demonstrated, and he was convicted for corruption. Because what's interesting here, I don't have the document in front of me, because we're having this debate, let's say, in an improvised way, but we really need to go into the details for each defendant and each conviction. And we can clearly see that there are, let's say, very specific personal convictions. There were still 3 acquittals, including that of Eric Wirth, who was the former Minister of Labour and former Minister of Budget under Nicolas Sarkozy, and who was the campaign treasurer at the time. He was acquitted. Just like another person whose name I forget, who is the vice president of Airbus, who was acquitted. There were still 3 acquittals. That's still significant. And there were convictions, all different. There were, of course, committals to custody. That means being sent to prison immediately by the jury. Because in this case, there were 2 main intermediaries. There was Ziad Taqiyuddin, who has passed away, so he can no longer be convicted, because you can't convict someone who has died. Then there was Juhri, one of the 2 intermediaries, but they were enemies. I don't know if you recall, but they constantly feuded because they were dividing up the spoils. And what happened? We have Ziad Taqiyuddin, who was the main accuser of Nicolas Sarkozy for years, until he changed his mind, where he said, no, actually everything I said was false. I take back everything I said when I made my statement to Paris Match. It was false.
I'm taking all of that back.
And it was clearly shown that this retraction was made under pressure. And that's what I'm getting at. Next week, on October 8th, there will be a decision about this very issue. Because Nicolas Sarkozy is currently on trial for witness tampering in relation to Ziad Taqeddin. So that's basically the issue at hand. And when we hear, well, this pack of journalists and this pack of politicians who are shouting scandal about the justice system, I want to tell you something, my dear Aldo. I am very proud of our justice system because it's the only current power in France that is truly, well, independent. And that is really competent. And that is truly, let's say, legitimate. Why am I telling you this? Because as you know, Aldo, there are three branches of power. There is the executive branch, there is the legislative branch, and there is the judicial branch.
The executive branch is the President of the Republic, and then there's the Prime Minister and his government. You saw that.
The legitimacy of that power is completely destroyed. Emmanuel Macron is no longer legitimate at all. People keep talking about either resignation or impeachment. He has completely deconstructed the French Republic. He has completely deconstructed France. He has reduced France to silence. Whereas France, well, used to be listened to by the whole world.
But he had two terms, didn't he? But he had two terms. I mean, even though he's not legitimate, the French voted for him twice.
I agree with you. And that's the problem with voting. But voting is just an isolated moment, Aldo. And that's where I want to get to something. You've read it, of course, that magnificent work, Nicomachean Ethics, which is a work by Aristotle that we all study when we're in our first or second year of law school, and even in our final years sometimes. And the politician, from the moment he presents himself as a national representative, he must respect an ethic. And what is the characteristic of ethics? It's virtue. And this was later taken up by Montesquieu, centuries later, in the spirit of the laws, and virtue is an essential quality, in the sense that one must be fully committed when aspiring to representative positions. One must be completely selfless, obviously qualified, and must express this virtue both in public and in private. In this sense, in private life, well, the paterfamilias is emphasized. And in exchange, what is there? There is what we call Feidstrust. And what did the president of the criminal court state the day before yesterday? She said that these are, acts of exceptional seriousness, which undermine the trust of the population, of the citizen in the people who represent them. That's actually something that is pointed out in a very targeted and accurate way.
Yes, but Councillor, if we must reference Aristotle and Montesquieu, you can imagine that since then, as you can see over time, since the time of these illustrious figures, there has been an extremely deep decline in the political class, hasn't there? And I think that if we start judging others, isn't it everyone, starting with Macron, based precisely on these ideals? Isn't it from these ancestors, these illustrious figures? There aren't many who will come out greater, right?
Absolutely. So
the judge, she says, yes, we don't trust, but I don't think it's Sarkozy who, well, he was involved, but nowadays no one trusts anyone anymore. All the institutions, whether they're European, national or local, well, are totally discredited. I don't think Sarkozy's conviction on its own is going to change anything.
So there are 2 points of view on this. There's the point of view that says that there is an inversion of values and that the norm has become quote-unquote evil. I'll give you a simple example. Now, when you walk somewhere and hold the door for a lady behind you, it seems strange. In fact, even the lady looks at you oddly. I'm sure you've experienced it too, Aldo. In any case, I experience it regularly when I enter a building and so on. The lady is stunned and confused, taken aback, because the norm is now to just let go of the door and walk away. The person doesn't even look behind them anymore. So there are a lot of examples like that. But what I'm getting at is that the day before yesterday, we experienced a great moment of democracy because the French criminal court demonstrated against all odds, against everyone, despite all the procedural subtleties put forward by the lawyers of Nicolas Sarkozy and the other defendants. Despite, the media pressure that tried to fuel behind it popular outrage, despite all that, it sent a very clear message that the law is equal for everyone and that no one is above the law, and that even the highest representatives of the state must be held accountable. And that's fundamental. And what's really incredible, and the big paradox, is that we have Nicolas Sarkozy, who has always advocated zero tolerance, who has always denounced the leniency of the justice system, who has always thought it was too soft. That's a message that has obviously been picked up by the right and the far right, of course. It's displayed every day. Well, when the justice system does its job, then suddenly the tone changes. And they start talking about hatred, and that's shameful. It's shameful because that's what we call a double standard. It's reasoning that changes depending on the situation, and that's unacceptable. On one side, excuse me for the term, there would be the riffraff. And on the other side, well, there would be this white-collar crime that by definition should be untouchable as long as it's clever crime. And that's just not right at all, because we have very high-level, high-flying political and financial crime. And what's amazing is that the French justice system has shown that despite its limited resources, despite all the pressure I've mentioned, it still delivers a highly motivated judgment. So regarding that, what will happen next? Nicolas Sarkozy has announced that he will file an appeal. Very well. Now, a little legal subtlety. He has a committal order, but it's deferred. That is unlike jury, where apparently at the moment the presiding judge delivered the verdict and the sentence. Well, two police officers stood up and walked toward jury, so he was immediately taken to prison. Nicolas Sarkozy's case is postponed. He is now summoned to the National Financial Prosecutor's Office on October 13, which will decide on his incarceration. You should know that since, well, he is still a defendant, he can't have any sentence adjustments. That's not possible. So now he might eventually discuss certain technical details that I don't know about because I'm not at the heart of the case. But in any case, it is certain that in the coming days, the coming weeks, or at the latest, the coming months, well, he will be incarcerated at Santé Prison in a standard cell of 9 to 12 square meters with weekly visits, 3 visits per week, and so on. But where I'm getting at is that since he filed an appeal, automatically the National Financial Prosecutor's Office also filed an appeal. What does that mean technically? In relation to the Paris Court of Appeal, which will make a decision in 6 months, it means that the Paris Court of Appeal will start everything over from scratch, and the Paris Court of Appeal could impose an even harsher penalty. That's right?
But in 10 years,
Sorry?
can we appeal for years?
Oh, no, not at all.
We can appeal, which may take even longer.
Not at all. Not at all. The Court of Appeal will make a decision in 2026. That's obvious. When I say she'll start from scratch, she won't repeat the investigation, so be careful. But she will review the case file, study the case file, because here, for example, Nicolas Sarkozy was acquitted of certain charges, for example, passive corruption. Well, the Paris Court of Appeal may decide that no, there was actual passive corruption. The Paris Court of Appeal may consider that there was indeed concealment, and so on and so on. So here, Nicolas Sarkozy, by filing an appeal, is taking a very big risk, because here, in light of what just happened, meaning this media frenzy, this political frenzy, even against the judge herself, she was attacked personally, people said she was completely biased, and in fact it was pointed out that A few years ago, she had taken part in a protest against Nicolas Sarkozy. But here too, our code of criminal procedure is, well, extraordinarily well equipped. That is, when there is suspicion about a judge, well, there is the principle of requesting recusal. It's possible. Knowing that it's easy to point the finger at this judge simply because she handed down the conviction. Knowing that, as I told you, there were dozens of judges who looked into this case. She wasn't the only one.
But she delivered the verdict. I'm not talking about Sarkozy, just speaking generally. We have a defendant who comes in, he's found guilty. Then we find out that the judge took part as a civilian in a protest against him. I mean, if that's not corruption of justice, there would still be some kind of connection, that's all.
Well, calling it corruption, I wouldn't use that term because, as I told you, there's still a fundamental principle. The judge takes an oath. He takes an oath on principles of independence, and that's really fundamental. And here, what's good is that there's this notion of an appeal process. So let's suppose, well, that she was completely biased. Let's suppose, well, there is an appeal process. And to use that term against this judge and against justice in general harms our democracy. Because that would mean that there is no justice in our country just because, well, a former president of the republic has been convicted. You have to know that every day, well, there are detention orders issued and no one is shocked by that. And on the contrary, remember just recently during the demonstration that took place 2 weeks ago in France, people were taken into custody and the public demanded firm justice. So it's this double standard that's not good. In this sense, well, I'm repeating myself, when it comes to the general public, to an ordinary person, well, the full force of the law is brought down and people think that's a good thing. And when this justice deals with subtleties, with people who are supposed to embody us, with people who are supposed to represent us, then it's not okay. We saw this with Marine Le Pen, who, well, cried scandal regarding her conviction. We'll see what happens because she has filed an appeal. The Paris Court of Appeal will make a decision in February. The trial will be reopened in February. So now we're going to move forward, but where we really need to insist is that Nicolas Sarkozy is a repeat offender. He's not a first-time offender. That means Nicolas Sarkozy has already been convicted for, well, active corruption of magistrates, of people in authority. You know...
He led him astray.
Yes, that's right. So you are still this judge of the Court of Cassation after all, and who...
And the judge, he took the money. The judge, he took the money. Nobody's perfect. That's what I've been trying to say since the beginning of the video.
Yes, there was still a conviction by the Paris Court of Appeal in 2023, and the Court of Cassation confirmed it. So it's a final decision. He was sentenced to prison with some time to serve. There was still the Pygmalion case. Pygmalion is about the financing of the election campaign. This is no longer 2007, but 2012. There was a 20 million euro limit, but there it was up to 45 million euros. 25 million euros more. And so there is already a conviction. And now the Court of Appeal will make a decision on October 8th. So considering all these elements, what did the judge take into account? She considered that Nicolas Sarkozy acted as if he were at a rally, as if he were campaigning, and did not present himself as a citizen who is expected to cooperate in the context of an investigation. And Nicolas Sarkozy kept downplaying his previous convictions and kept criticizing the judicial system. Considering these elements, and given the exceptional seriousness of the facts, well, she felt that in order for the disturbance to public order not to continue, not to persist, well, she ordered detention. So there is still a whole line of reasoning that they wanted to dismiss. And that's what harms our justice system, our political class, and our country. Because once again, we should have waited at least, let's say, a few hours before making a statement and not acted impulsively.
so that there would be, I repeat once again, this pact behind Nicolas Sarkozy. Because what does this hide? Obviously, it still hides a very serious problem. It's that we have a man has participated in the desacralization of the presidential office, a man who participated in the deconstruction of presidential authority, and a man who even participated in the deconstruction of our country. I will explain myself. You remember that famous phrase, "Get lost, you poor idiot. You remember the Carker."
Don't touch me. You're dirtying me. Get lost, you idiot. Yes, I remember that story.
You remember as well, aren't you tired of the scum? We're going to get rid of them for you. You remember Carla and me, it's serious and so on and so on. That's not what was expected from a presidential role, especially after Jacques Chirac. You may like or dislike Jacques Chirac, but in any case, he had a presidential demeanor, and he was universally recognized and universally respected, especially internationally. And here we still have Nicolas Sarkozy, who was, and still is, by the way, constantly gesticulating. And that damaged France's credibility, especially regarding its war in Libya, because there too we are still suffering the consequences. Because behind all that, what happened? We still had a regime, as dictatorial as it was, that was still a barrier to migration towards Europe. And we all agree with that observation. From the moment Gaddafi was eliminated, from the moment the Libyan state was completely disintegrated, from the moment we returned to a tribal system that is almost medieval, well, we see what happens. This tidal wave of migration is causing very serious social and economic problems for all European countries, especially in terms of crime. And Italy knows this well, especially with the island of Lampedusa. So we have someone who acts, let's say, impulsively, who acts, let's say, without thinking things through, and who, even to this day, despite having been convicted, still hasn't learned any lessons from everything that happened to him, still hasn't learned any lessons from the convictions. And I think that's what annoyed the judge. And I think that's what will annoy even more the Paris Court of Appeal, where, well, in light of everything that just happened, will take even greater care in considering its decision and his conviction. That's for sure. In any case, on the political level, Sarkozy, who also took part in the dismantling of the right, who contributed to the normalization of the far right, let's not forget that he had Patrick Buisson as an advisor, a major figure of the far right, a leading ideologue of the far right, very close to Jean-Marie Le Pen. And so he has...
But he didn't want to. He could have won the election the second time if he had allied with the National Rally, but he didn't want to do it. He could have served a second term as president instead of Hollande.
Absolutely, absolutely. And he didn't want to because he considered that by having Patrick Buisson. Well, he managed to pull off, let's say, a gamble in 2007, and that this gamble could work again in 2012. But in the meantime, well, what happened? The far right, disappointed by the unfulfilled promises of Nicolas Sarkozy, went back to its original party. And besides, Jean-Marie Le Pen had said it with a lot of confidence because he's a man of experience. He was a man of experience. He said people will eventually prefer the original over the copy. That made an impression on Jean. He said it in both 2007 and 2012. People preferred the original over the copy, and that's the case with Nicolas Sarkozy. And I think it's time to turn the page. Nicolas Sarkozy, both politically and in terms of his legal issues. Why do I mention his legal issues? Because let's not forget that Nicolas Sarkozy is still a member of the board of directors at Accor. He is a member of the board of directors of the Lagardère Group. And it's not impossible that there will be new cases because there are ongoing investigations concerning Nicolas Sarkozy, especially regarding the Qatar World Cup and his active role in getting Fédération Internationale de Football Association to award the World Cup to Qatar, which was surprising at the time, do you remember? And besides, it's the first country to have hosted the World Cup in winter, for reasons we all know, of course. As a result, the investigation is still ongoing. He hasn't been charged yet, but he could be. There's also another case involving the Lagardère group because Lagardère signed an agreement with Qatar Investment Authority for stock exchange transactions. And Nicolas Sarkozy was very active in this deal, and Nicolas Sarkozy, as a thank you, was appointed to the board of directors of the Lagardère group. So here, as they say, it's never ending. And I think it's time to put an end to all this, to put an end to these practices, because we are experiencing an institutional crisis of great importance, of extreme seriousness. We still don't have a government in France. We've already had 5 prime ministers since Emmanuel Macron's second election. We can discuss it later in a live session if you want. So this matter needs to be handled, let's say, very calmly and with a lot of respect. The very calm way is because this matter is very complex. And I think we're not done making discoveries, I'd say, of our surprises. Because there's one fundamental element, and this is the first place, and I'm going to tell you what that fundamental element is. It's that you have the Association of the Victims of the Union of Air Transport Douglas Commercial, 10 Flight 772 bombing. That association became a civil party in this trial. And Madam President, the criminal court recognized the constitution of a civil party.
They're not going to pin an accident on him. Sarkozy was nothing at all at the time of the Union of Air Transport attack. We're not going to pin it on him after the fact. We're not going to rewrite history. He's a despicable character, and I agree with you, Councillor. I'm not defending him, even though in a way, as a Maghrebi myself, I see a 70-year-old man being dragged from court to court, and all the anger just goes away. That's all. So on a human level, I have a bit of a hard time. That's all.
That's an excellent question, but look at the reasoning that was established. It's that we have a fact that took place in 1989, indeed. And in 1989, Sarkozy was a complete unknown. He was the mayor of Neuilly, period. Very well, that was already not bad. And here you have the document, Q, published by Mediapart in 2012. What did this association consider? It considered that the fact that at the highest level of the state, we are dealing with a state terrorist who has been recognized as the main actor and instigator of an attack that caused deaths. From the moment at the highest level of the French state, from the moment Brice Hortefeux secretly went to Libya to meet Abdallah Senussi. Well, that causes us harm. Why? Because that meeting was intended to clear his name later and to reintegrate his boss into the concert of nations. The fact of having done all that causes me direct harm. It's an attack on my morals. It's an attack on ethics. It's an attack on my dignity as a descendant of a victim. And so, as a result, I am joining as a civil party because I am suffering direct harm, well, from this organized group.
I understand the reasoning of the victims, right? But at the same time, you say it's a first in law. We're beta testing the law on Mr. Sarkozy. We're going all out on him. It's a real ham, egg, cheese vibe, throwing everything we have at him. Even the association come along too. In 89, he was nothing at all. But we'll discuss. We'll come up with some reasoning. At that price, we could also talk about the Kennedy assassination. I'm sure that, depending on how the reasoning goes, we could bring Sarkozy's name into the story. I don't know. I feel like there's still an excess. Because even when we talk about French justice crushes people like a steamroller. Me, I feel like it's more of a lax justice than anything else. And that, suddenly, with Fillon, the whole suit story, and with Sarkozy, there's still a kind of, that I don't want to say harassment, but you understand a bit. The way I see all this...
Yes, I can easily understand it. Once again, in this kind of situation, there's the analysis on one hand, there's the emotion on the other hand, and finally, there's the point of view. When you have the point of view, when you have the emotion, indeed,
You can be shocked, you can. You can be shocked because actually all the cameras are focused on the event. We're dealing with sensationalism and we pull back and avoid details since we shouldn't discuss them. Why am I telling you this? That's why I return to the analysis, which is crucial. The thing is, this trial still lasted more than 3 months, more than 3.5 months even, almost 4 months, let's say. But let's just suppose 3 months, which is huge. Did you, Aldo, get the daily report of what was being said in court about the exchanges, about the debate? Nothing.
Yes, not at all. We were busy with something else. And then, well, suddenly we learned that, well,
Total blackout.
Total blackout. And everyone who echoes what they experienced during those 3 months of the trial, whether it's certain meticulous journalists or victim associations, including those of the attack victims, whether it's anti-corruption associations, because there are anti-corruption associations that also became civil parties. So all these organizations, all these people have kept saying that there have been very heated debates, there have been incredible showdowns, there have been incredible exchanges, which means that at some point there was a shift between allegation and assertion, especially from Brice Hortefeux and Claude Guéant. And the reality is that Nicolas Sarkozy is the boss. Let me explain. During the entire trial and investigation, Nicolas Sarkozy abandoned his collaborators, saying, "They did everything. I knew nothing about it." He completely abandoned them, even though Claude Guéant did later when Nicolas Sarkozy was president. He was his chief of staff at the Élysée, and Brice Hortefeux became his minister of the interior. Just that.
yeah, it's ugly. It's ugly.
He let them down, and throughout the whole trial, Hortefeux and Guéant kept saying no, but Nicolas Sarkozy had no idea at all. We did everything ourselves, we didn't get any orders, we didn't get any instructions. We did everything on our own, except that... Apparently, I say this because I wasn't at the hearings, just what the victims reported. However, systematically, the evidence that was presented was completely ridiculous, completely inappropriate. And what came out of that stance? In fact, there really was a criminal association with Nicolas Sarkozy at the head. So, of course, I agree with you, Aldo, because you're going to tell me that there is, well, a relentless pursuit. But the relentless pursuit, I think, needs to be put into perspective, considering, as I told you, the previous convictions. There were still 2 of them, where again there were a lot of debates. And what does that actually reveal? Something very serious about our country. It's that the one who was leading us at the head of the Republic, at the head of France, well, turns out to be a very high-level gangster. And now that raises a problem about the checks and balances. That raises a problem about ethics. I mentioned it, but it especially raises a problem about the real resources given to checks and balances and the real resources given to investigators. That's what causes the problem. That is to say, if his conviction is ever upheld in peace, if on October 8th it is confirmed regarding Pygmalion, then he has some very serious questions to ask himself regarding a former president of the Republic. And that's a debate we should have, because that debate, for example, has already taken place in other countries. I'll mention just one that you know very well, Brazil, with Lula. Lula was still sentenced to prison and he served his sentence.
There was Korea and Peru.
Lula, when he served his prison sentence, ran again in a presidential election and he was elected, facing a person, Bolsonaro, who kept pointing out precisely the left schemes and so on. So, and there, who on the planet would question Lula's legitimacy? No one. Why? Because unlike what happens here, there was respect for judicial authority. And that's very important after all. Because from the moment you say that the judicial authority is biased, as a whole, without any distinction, that's really serious. From the moment the one who was supposed to be the nation's referee, well, behaves like a high-level, high-profile delinquent, it creates a problem for our institution.
Question. I have a question. If I zoom out, if I step outside the legal framework, let me give you some reasoning. How will France look if a president of the republic ends up handcuffed, sent to prison in front of journalists from all over the world? I'm discussing France's institutional credibility. On one hand, yes, we can say in France, bravo, no one is above the law. That works. But we can also say, wow, they still have criminals, criminal organizations, all of that reaching the top, reaching power, reaching the presidency. Honestly, I wonder one way or another if France really won by convicting Sarkozy. If maybe they shouldn't have swept the case under the rug and let it die out for the sake of the greater good.
Well, I think that the question you're asking, I don't know if you're psychic or if it's a premonition, but I think your question raises the issue of change. Not a change of regime, but a change of paradigm. Why am I telling you this? Because this will be the third time in the history of France as a whole since Clovis, since the Kingdom of France. This will only be the third time that a head of state will be in prison. The first was Louis XVI, and you saw the shift that followed, and the second was Pétain, and you saw the shift that followed. Now we have Nicolas Sarkozy. I think this signals a shift. The shift is when enough is enough. The shift is when you've gone too far. The shift is when you've been warned several times, but nothing has changed. The shift. It's especially this general economic context where there's an explosion of unemployment, a loss of values, a breakdown of the political class, and so on. All of that signals a shift. So I don't know who will come next. I don't know who will replace Macron. I don't know who will replace the empty body that still hasn't formed a government. I don't know anything about all that. But in any case, one thing is certain. It's that major shifts often come from the judicial authority, because the judicial authority is always part of a continuum. The judicial authority is more or less the same despite changes in the regime. The Conseil d'État in France, which is the Supreme Court of Administrative Jurisdictions, the Conseil d'État was nothing more than the King's Council before. And so, as a result, there is a kind of continuum, and this continuum has a concern and a frame of reference. What is the concern? It's to ensure public order. Even before the police, even before the army, it's the judge who ensures public order. And what is the frame of reference? It's the law, it's the code, because we must not forget one thing, which is this notion of provisional enforcement, this notion of deferred detention warrant and others, this notion of criminal conspiracy, but all of this was voted on by the legislator. It's not the judge who wrote the Code of Criminal Procedure. The judge only applies the law. He interprets it and applies it. And so given these elements, it's clear that this looks bad for France. It's clear that this raises a legitimacy issue for France. But I would make the opposite argument. Isn't it necessary, in light of the deconstruction of France, in light of its loss of influence, while everywhere in the world people continue to praise it, but the people who are supposed to represent it do not honor this praise? Well, in this context, shouldn't we actually wipe the slate clean on many things and not build the future with those who have destroyed our present?
Thank you for these beautiful words. Thank you for sharing your insight with us. And then we'll see each other again on this channel. There are a lot of things to say about Sarkozy next year, about Marine Le Pen, and also about Mr. Lecornu. And sometimes I wonder if he won't resign even before forming a government. In any case, thank you for your loyalty, for your support of this channel, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you, Aldo. Thank you.